Hey everybody, I just wanted to take a little bit of time to revisit a couple of discussions from the past few weeks. It's always a good idea to kind of, move forward on some stuff and then go back and revisit it again, remind you of some ideas so that you can kind of continue to incorporate important ideas from the class into future discussions, right? If we're talking about socialization or identity or the idea of structural injustice, all of those things are theories that can be applied to every discussion for the rest of the semester. So I'd like you to keep thinking about that and thinking about the idea of revisiting previous discussions and revisiting previous ideas. Especially like related to ethics, for example. Could you apply some of the stuff that you learned through the Code of Ethics Analysis essay to the ethical situations that we're facing by reading things in the Invisible Hands book? So just wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about the idea of structural injustice. And just to reiterate real quick, a lot of times with structural injustice, we're talking about situations that are beyond our control. And some people may see that as an excuse to then not do anything because it's beyond their control. But the point is that there are small things that can be done if you can recognize them. And I think somebody mentioned that in the discussion board, that once you start to recognize things, you start to be more aware of things, and then that awareness can lead to something else, right? So keep in mind those ideas of unintended consequences as well. Those unintended consequences are accumulated. They're the accumulated actions of the masses of people, people who may just kind of reinforce something without even knowing it. And the idea is that what's usually reinforced is that smaller groups of people, people who are underrepresented, are either abused or marginalized or even just ignored. And so how do you start to pay attention and how do you start to notice the people that maybe aren't as noticeable? And it takes more effort to live that way. And it's intentional, right? So try to start living intentionally and thinking about, I'm not really part of the problem, so I don't really need to think about it because I'm not doing anything directly. But that's the difference between thinking personally about what you're doing and thinking systemically about how you might participate in a system that is already oppressive, and you may help reinforce it just by participating in it. And so it's good to try to start questioning that and see what happens when I start to push against the status quo. And I think what you'll find is when you do start to push against the status quo, you start to feel the resistance. Those of you who may have identities, social identities, that have put you in positions where you have been oppressed in some way, understand what it feels like to have the system push against you. Some people who maybe have more privileged identities maybe haven't felt that as much. So I would encourage you, if you are coming from a more privileged identity or a set of identities or social location, try to find ways to test the limits of your privilege. And I think that's where you start to actually make some changes to the structure of things, right? So, what can we do in our own communities to combat structural injustice? One is civic involvement. You can simply just talk to people. You can help educate yourself and spread facts. You can identify and call out injustice. You can say something about it, right? And you'd be really surprised, I think, when you do start saying things that go against the status quo. You'll see that the pushback is pretty incredible and can be very, very disruptive to your life. And that's something to think about, is that people who come from underprivileged backgrounds have to face that already. And it's quite possible that many of you have experienced that due to race or class or sexual orientation or gender, right? Or religion, all of those things that we've talked about. Also, something that you might do is to try to start attending events, public events, where you might run into people who are different than you. Like if you're like, I just don't know, I don't have many friends who are a different race than me. How do I find friends? How do I make friends without walking up and saying, hey, you're such and such race, I'd like to meet you because you're that, right? That in itself is racist at at a less harmful level, but how do you just end up in a situation and start to participate with people, and start to break down some of those barriers? That's what you need to try to start doing. That's what we need to try to start doing, not just you, me too, right? Something else you might think of is if you're ever an employer, think about paying fair wages. If you're somebody who rents out a house to someone, think about charging someone a fair rent, things like that. And then also, demand that lawmakers start to support things like higher education that help support people in disadvantaged positions. The amount of money that's going to public education continues to drop, and that creates structural change that shows that what society is not really invested in is the education of its students, or of its kids, of its adults, right? So start thinking about that. Public education is not funded primarily by the public anymore. A lot of public education is funded by private entities, and think about how that might lead to ethical issues and problems of power. So also start thinking about the idea of, when is being aware not enough, right? A lot of people talked about, it's good to just be aware, and that's true, but at some point that awareness needs to translate to action, otherwise structural injustice will not be